Hopefully today we'll be able to give you an overview of some of the complexities and what it means to try and consider marine net gain within the constraints of a regulatory system, which are quite challenging at times. After we've had our presentation from Audrey, there'll be a panel discussion that will include me and Audrey, but also Hayley and Henk. For those of you that don't know Hayley and Henk, Henk is our research impact lead here at HMC and has been working on ECOWind and Insight. And Hayley, Hayley's been with us at the same time as Henk and is working, been working with DEFRA, looking at reviewing marine monitoring, but also on natural capital and other kind of biodiversity related things. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion at the end. So please do think of questions as we're going through and put them in the chat, and I'll make sure to raise them at the end. I have a few prepared in case we don't get any, but I'm sure we will. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Audrey to take us through our presentation. Audrey.
Thank you, Dickon. Nice to see so many people here. I wasn't expecting quite this many. So I'll just give you a quick sort of high-level overview of sort of the background to marine net gain policy. As I'm sure many of you will know, net gain is an approach to development that leaves the environment in a better state than before. And the Environment Act introduced biodiversity net gain as the main to the main terrestrial planning regimes. And now we're looking at how you might develop this for the marine environment. And the purpose being to reverse the loss of marine biodiversity, but to embed environmental improvement into the heart of infrastructure planning and development, and to leave the environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. The government recognises, due to the important differences in the physical makeup and regulation of the marine environment, MNG is being considered from first principles rather than just trying to fully adopt the BNG terrestrial approach into the marine environment. So, as some of you may know, DEFRA consulted on proposed principles for net gain in June 2022. And this included questions on how you might define MNG. So should it contain habitats and species? Should it incorporate wider environmental benefits? Should it include positive incidental benefits as a result of developments? Should it be a metric style approach or contributions-based approach or something different? What types of interventions could be included? Could it be considered at a strategic level? And can it be delivered within marine protected areas? And then in December 2023, DEFRA published their response to this, stating that it will include both habitats and mobile species, which is different to BNG, which just includes habitats. It will be a nature-first approach, but it could incorporate wider environmental benefits, providing they're underpinned by biodiversity. They're suggesting it maybe should look at contributions-based approach first. And importantly, fishing is not in scope for having to deliver MNG due to lots of existing legislation to manage environmental impacts of fishing. However, it is in scope for the potential pressure removal or reduction measures to enable MNG. And improvements to MPA features are in scope for MNG. That just gives you a bit of background. So this slide just highlights the sort of breadth of work that's required to potentially get MNG into a position where it could be mandatory. Today, I'm just going to talk about some of the evidence projects that HMC is involved in under this, all the different projects here, and we're delivering a number of projects for Natural England and DEFRA. So the first one is the MNG assessment tool. The next one is looking at ecological opportunities and priorities for MNG, and thirdly is a project looking at pilots or potential pilots for testing MNG. And all these projects are interlinked, with the outputs from each of them informing the others. And the evidence in these will all feed into the policy development and delivery model to make MNG a coherent policy. And I guess a key part underpinning this is stakeholder engagement and learning from what's already happened under the implementation of BNG. So firstly, I'll talk about the Marine Net Gain Assessment Framework project, which I know a number of you on this call have already been involved with. So Natural England has contracted HMC to undertake a project to assess potential frameworks that could be used to measure ecological losses and gains. Important to say, we're not developing a metric. The project is looking to understand the evidence base behind different approaches to measuring ecological loss and gains for both habitats and mobile species. And this is ranging from looking at individual features to the complexity of understanding natural capital benefits. And under this project, we're only looking at the subtidal elements. And by habitats, benthic habitats, this includes biogenic species such as oyster beds and seagrass beds. And mobile species means fish, birds, and marine mammals. And a key part of the project is to facilitate discussions and be collaborative in our approach to try and reach consensus on what is possible and what is not possible from a methodological perspective, a data perspective, and usability perspective. So within the first part of this project, we looked at the different frameworks that are already in existence to assess loss and gain in the marine environment, to determine those which we'd like to consider further in phase 2 of the project. And this included looking at approaches that made assessments at different ecosystem levels. And the output of this literature search was that it demonstrated that frameworks aren't actually completely distinct from each other. They're all actually underpinned by a shared requirement for information on biodiversity, whether this is at an individual feature-based level or going up to a wider ecosystem functionality level, or even up to the natural capital level. We therefore proposed a nested approach to testing assessment frameworks, starting with a feature-based approach at the bottom, which focuses on individual species and habitats, as is done under most regulatory regimes at the moment. But then this feeds into the wider contribution that those features make at an ecosystem functionality level, such as a prey resource, a hard substrate, nursery area, etc. And this further then feeds into values and benefits resulting from ecosystem services at a natural capital level, such as water quality, flood defence, ecotourism. And what we wanted to test is whether each level is compatible with each other. So can losses and gains measured at one level be translated into losses and gains at a different level in the framework? With the idea to sort of potentially expand wider opportunities on how you might want to deliver gain in relation to any losses in the marine environment, and also to start to consider the wider ecosystem interactions. But we recognise that habitats and mobile species may need to be treated differently depending on the evidence base behind them. So, as some of you on this call will know, as part of this process, we set up a technical advisory group. And the purpose of this was to provide an expert view on whether the different frameworks can be used to measure ecological loss and gain for benthic habitats and mobile species. And as part of this process, we use real-world scenarios which were developed using information gathered from environmental impact assessments. So this just provides a very, very high-level summary. There's a lot more detail behind this, which we're still working through as we start to sort of work into our final report to decide what an assessment framework potentially could be. But the high-level points that came out of the TAG workshop were that it's possible to measure loss at a feature level for benthic and seabirds, but it's actually very challenging for marine mammals based on the data that we currently hold around these species. The advice was that gain should be at a strategic coordinated framework level to enable wider ecosystem benefits, and where possible this should be linked to good environmental status. And it was recognised that ecosystem modelling could be used to help develop this. Overall, there was broad support for developing an ecosystem functionality and natural capital approach, but recognising there's actually further information and data is required to operationalise this, and maybe it couldn't be delivered with the current knowledge at the current time. So there's been a slight delay in being able to engage with stakeholders due to the change of government. But the next steps in this project is to go and test the outputs from the tag with end users and regulators to understand the usability and deliverability of the recommendations that came from the scientific advice. And then the overall outputs from the project will be an expert consensus on the approaches that can and cannot be used for delivering MNG across species and habitats. From a methodology perspective, any data requirements, the level of uncertainty associated with each of the approaches, and how deliverable they are. And as I said earlier, these are based on testing with real-world scenarios. And the overall output will be recommendations to ENI and DEFRA, which can support the development of a mechanism for MNG going forwards. So the next project I'd like to talk about is the marine restoration potential for marine mobile species, or MAREPO Plus. And this builds on an earlier project called MAREPO, which explored the restoration potential of some key threatened and declining subtidal marine habitats, such as kelp forest, mole beds, native oyster beds, horse mussel beds, and sea pen and burrowing megafauna communities. So MAREPO Plus is looking at the restoration potential of priority mobile species in England. And by mobile species, we mean fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. So the project is first going to identify and characterise a long list of potential actions needed for restoration based on a literature search and advice from Natural England specialists. The next stage will be to develop criteria to prioritise the actions based on known or potential ecological success in the context of achieving restoration of species in English waters. And this will include considerations of the ecological impact, so the impact of an action on the abundance and health of species of English importance, as well as any proven success. It will consider the deliverability, so is there evidence for implementation? Can the action be taken within an English context, or would it require further larger scale cooperation? What is the cost of delivering the action and any timescale for recovery? And can it, importantly, be measured? I will also consider any added value. So could actions benefit other priority species or groups? And would they contribute to existing policy objectives or strategies? And the next stage, an important stage, is to explore any interactions between actions across the species, groups and habitats to understand if anything is benefiting or disbenefiting others. And I guess that's to provide that wider ecosystem understanding of what actions can do. And lastly, the project will produce a marine restoration action plan, which will consider considering suitable geographies, such as marine plan regions or biogeographic regions, as well as rough timescales for success. And this project will feed into the Marine Net Gain Assessment Framework project because it will help provide an understanding of where there are opportunities for delivering gain for mobile species, as well as feeding into the next project that I was going to talk about, which is the Marine Net Gain Pilot Development Project. So this project is going to develop recommendations for pilot projects in English waters that demonstrate potential implementation pathways to deliver gains for marine net gain. It will provide a plan for what is in scope for 5 MNG pilot projects and recommendations on how these could be delivered. It will highlight any challenges that need to be overcome to make the delivery pathway a success, but importantly is not actually directly delivering the pilots. And the outputs from the MAREPO and MAREPO Plus, as well as other restoration projects, will feed into shaping how the pilots are taken forward. So we're looking at pilots under 4 different themes. Firstly, pressure reduction, and this refers to the management and regulation of human activities to reduce pressure on the environment, such as, for example, fishing. The next theme is active restoration, and that includes targeted actions implemented to actively restore or recover marine features and the processes that can or potentially could enable this. The third theme is the BNG-MNG interface, which will consider the delivery of terrestrial or intertidal biodiversity net gain in the interaction of this delivery with marine net gain. And the fourth theme is a strategic approach. And this will look at strategic mechanisms for the delivery of marine net gain at national, regional and local levels. It will also include a consideration of how sort of wider marine planning and policy development feeds into this strategic approach. Under each of the themes, we've determined an evaluation objective, which states what we're trying to achieve under each of the themes. And then for each of the themes, we've identified potential delivery pathways that would be needed to implement MNG under each of them. So, for example, in order to implement pressure reduction, you potentially could need bylaws, you potentially could need fisheries management. It could be delivered as an additional management measure in marine protected areas, and you could potentially require seabed leasing to secure it in the longer term. Under Theme 2, Active Restoration, it could be delivered by developers, NGOs or private finance, as a number of restoration projects are already being done so. But also it could be led and delivered solely by government. Again, it could be delivered as additional management within existing marine protected areas, and you could require a seabed lease in order to secure this in the longer term. And under active intervention, marine licensing and permitting will be an important consideration in how to sort of secure and deliver this, particularly for measures such as nature inclusive design, as well as how you might consider decommissioning and how you might want to use that to make sure that any nature inclusive design or other MNG interventions are secured in the longer term. And then the BNG-MNG interface, we'll just look at how we interface between that intertidal and subtidal. And the strategic approach will consider the development of a strategic plan for marine net gain, as well as how you might want to look at more strategic nature leasing going forwards. We've also devised a set of evaluation topics or questions that could be tested under each of the pathways, under each of the themes. And these are based on elements that Natural England would like to be tested under this project. So these are things such as location. So is the delivery of marine net gain under this theme different if it's within the footprint of the development or outside the footprint of the development? Would there be different considerations if it was delivered inside or outside 12 nautical miles? Is it different if it's delivered inside or outside marine protected areas? How would you secure gain under this process? How would you monitor? How would you fund? So there's lots of different themes there and sort of different questions that we'd like to test as we develop the pilots. And we have then allocated each evaluation topic under each of the pathways to come up with this evaluation framework. And this is just an example. There are more to it than this. And we will then use this framework to develop case studies for pilots. And our intention is to then test these case studies and refine them and prioritise them using stakeholder engagement, with the ultimate end goal being to produce up to 5 pilots that will test priority pathways for each theme. And one of the key issues to test is that not one single organisation has oversight or ownership across all the pathways within a theme. So how do you ultimately secure and monitor gain in the longer term, which is something we'd like to test under the pilots. So thank you for listening, and we can now go over to the panel discussion, and I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm just going to put spotlights on everyone else so everyone can see us. and invite Henk and Hayley to turn their cameras on. So this is a really interesting area of policy. And while you were talking there, Hayley, sorry, Audrey, I was just reflecting on the fact that it's not often in the policy world, in the marine policy world, where you get to work on something that is completely new and that you're working up from first principles. And in fact, this working on this kind of reminds me of, I don't know, like 14 years ago when we were trying to decide how to make decisions in marine conservation zones, or even how to designate marine conservation zones and then make decisions on them. Or how to develop the programme of measures under what was then the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and is now the UKMS. And we're in that same kind of space, I guess, of trying to work things up from first principles. And we've often talked about in this process, there's an iteration between the policy aspiration that we have, which is to develop a means of restoring nature above and beyond what we already have in place. And there are lots of aspirations for how we do that. And the process we've been going through, I guess, is technically constraining that conversation. So what is actually possible to do? And net gain's interesting because you're working in possibly when we're looking at frameworks for delivering nature restoration, and there are lots of them in the private sector for some nature positive initiatives, and they are there in the NGO sector. When you're working in a regulatory framework, it's almost the most constrained that you can be, because the level of certainty you need around decisions and the scrutiny those decisions will come under is like nowhere else, I guess, which leads us into some interesting conversations about what is and isn't possible. I guess woven through what you've been talking about, we talked about looking at different levels, and I know that there is quite a lot of work out there at the moment where people are looking at natural capital and ecosystem services in relation to nature restoration. And within our work that we've been doing here, we've kind of been testing the operational limits of natural capital and ecosystem services, and whether it can or cannot be used in regulatory situations, and where it is best used or not. And I was just wondering, this is a question, I guess maybe to you first, Audrey, but I'd also be interested in what Hayley and Henk think about where natural capital can best be used in that kind of regulatory space, rather than in a private sector or an NGO type space.
Thanks. I guess I recognise this is a highly evolving area. So this is based on where we are now. But I guess the outputs, particularly from the discussions around the Marine Net Gain Assessment Framework project, is that natural capital at the moment is a useful tool to help us decide and maybe trade off between different gain measures. So it gives you an extra thing to consider where you may or may not want to put something. But the level of detail to drill it down to an individual project impact perspective just isn't there. And that's not necessarily how natural capital works as well. At that very small scale development project, it's a potentially a larger sort of regional seas, if not larger space. So I'd say there's definitely scope, particularly considering gain measures, but maybe not from actually assessing losses from individual developments.
Okay, which then makes it tricky in a market kind of based mechanism. Yeah. Henk, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, thanks, Dickon, and thanks for an interesting talk, Audrey. It's a very, very interesting space, this. With regards to how natural capital could be considered in a regulatory environment, I worked for a few years on DEFRA's Marine Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Program, and in there we were developing lots of different ideas through to the point where these could maybe become tools for how you would consider this exact question. And I think from some of my learnings through that process, a lot of the benefits in a natural capital approach is it helps you think about nature's services, its value that it can place on human beings. And I think a natural capital approach, it creates a means by which we can better connect human beings and their reliance on natural assets and goods and services. So it serves a very important function in connecting human beings, creating a means by which human beings can better connected with those natural assets. We're not always very well connected to nature around us. However, the challenge is how you bring that then into a regulatory environment and make it meaningful, because natural capital, when you're talking about ecosystem services, it's very hard to measure those, and it's very hard to then bring those into a decision framework in a tangible way. So sometimes it might just be kept at a qualitative level, that understanding those goods and services that are provided by nature, that might be the thing that needs to be brought in, qualitatively discussed in a regulatory environment, until we have a much better understanding of the exact mechanics and levels of delivery that underpin that. I don't know, Hayley also worked in the Marine Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Programme. She probably has a few thoughts on this as well.
Hey.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I agree that it's not necessarily an easy. It's a nice idea, and it's a valuable concept, and it has a lot of promise, but it's a very difficult thing to do, that has a lot of evidence requirements, I guess. So you're not only thinking about the natural assets and the ecology of those habitats, species, and communities, and how they function, but then what services they deliver, and who's deriving value from those benefits and where, and those things are often operating at different scales. So some of the more social benefits are being delivered perhaps at a very small scale. The assets might be operating and functioning at a very large scale. The further offshore you go, as you say, the more disconnected people feel from the marine environment. So the benefit, the services there are more sort of potentially regulating services, rather than sort of tangible things that people can pick up and value in more meaningful terms. So there's a lot of evidence requirement. There's a lot of data that's required, and then you need to have somewhere to put those data in the regulatory process. You need a mechanism by which to take all of that into account. And so the two sides of the coin there are, I guess, not necessarily up to scratch at the minute for enabling a natural capital approach, as Audrey said, but it's a really interesting avenue to keep exploring.
Thanks, Hayley. We've got loads of questions, and if I could ask people to put questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. That being said, I'm going to go to Kathy's questions in the chat first. So what I'm going to do is, there are some process kind of questions that we'll get through, I think, Audrey, with you and me, and then we've got some more discussion type questions. So Kathy's got a question about how this work interacts with the library of strategic compensation measures. So for people who aren't familiar with this, strategic compensation is an initiative under the habitats regulations, where DEFRA and indeed Scottish Government are looking at whether you can deliver like for like compensation on a strategic scale. So that's either looking at ecosystem functionality to some degree, or looking at delivering measures over a broad scale that several developers can buy into. Effectively, we've tried within this process to look at marine net gain on its own, mainly because that strategic compensation discussion is a difficult one that needs its own process to work through. That being said, the some of the technical assessment work within this marine net gain sphere will be really important, but to the strategic compensation work, both in terms of work on the Marine Recovery Fund and that library of measures. And what I'm going to just quickly do is go back to the Q&As. There was another one in here. So there was a question from Evelina about how this process is going to fit within a planning process such as a DCO, and have any projects come forward to test this process. At the moment, marine net gain is in development and isn't currently being used in the application process, but it would sit in that application process, whether it's a DCO or an oil and gas permit or an environmental permit or a marine license or whatever that might look like. No projects have come forward to test it yet because there isn't a framework in place, and that's the work that's ongoing at the moment. And the last sort of factual question from Claire, saying where are we with the pilot case study selection? So we've looked at those different delivery pathways, and what we're looking at is not location wise, but within these pathways, what are the questions we might want to ask, and what are the things that we might want to test? So again, what we're looking at with these is we're not saying that those delivery pathways are pathways that will be used, but they are pathways that need to be explored, because we need to understand what the limits of possibility are and start again constraining that conversation. So I think that once the pilot framework has been discussed and confirmed, that there will undoubtedly be a process by which Natural England and DEFRA might look at places to test them. But Audrey, I don't think that's within our scope of work, is it? And that will be done at some point in the new year.
No, we're not delivering it, but then saying that we will draw maybe on live experience that happen at the moment to help shape where you might want to develop the pilot sort of thing. So yes. Yeah.
So there are a couple of interesting questions about the interface between terrestrial net gain and intertidal net gain and offshore, and there's a couple of questions about the strategic approach. So I think we take the question about the interface first. For those people who aren't familiar, terrestrially we have a system of biodiversity net gain based around biodiversity credits that's pretty much features based, and there are a set of rules around which those credits can be traded, and within that there are rules around distinctiveness, so how special that habitat is, the certainty or uncertainty of delivering gain, which provide multipliers in ways or another, and there are challenges with that that I think everybody recognises, but broadly it's a working system. In the intertidal, that becomes a bit more complicated because the level of certainty goes down, so your multipliers and therefore the cost of those credits goes up. And then offshore, we're potentially looking at a case where you don't have a credit-based system at all, maybe because it's too complex. So there's a really interesting question about where you've got these different regulatory systems, how do they fit together well? And ecologically, you need to have them fitting together well, because you have source to sea effects of nutrients and lots of other things. Part of the work looking at the pilots is going to be setting out, these are the type of questions you need to ask when you're trying to assess how they sit well together. And I think that's an important point about a lot of this work, is we don't have the answers, we're just figuring out what questions do we need to ask, and it's kind of the beginning of that process. But there is a kind of broader question around ecological integrity at the coast and making sure that all fits well together. I'm going to go to Audrey first to see if you've got any comment on that, and then to Hayley and Hank potentially.
Yeah, so yeah, echoing what Dickon's saying there, I guess we're not at the point where we can test exactly all the different measures coming through. It's more almost asking those questions about how you might want to test it. And I think the key thing with the sort of the BNG MNG interface is really understanding what the issues are around that. So are there some measures that can be delivered both intertidally and subtidally? I guess seagrass might be one of those. And how would you actually make that work in practice, given there's potentially different or regulatory regimes governing those? There might be a different assessment framework which determines the amount you need to deliver over what time scale. So how would that potentially work in practice? And I think as you develop the wider measures, there will definitely need to be a nod into that sort of space of what are the other things influencing this. So there's no point delivering something where actually you haven't regulated everything. There's no point developing seagrass if all the nutrients are still flowing into that space, or it's not in a suitable place because you can't manage the rights of other activities that might impact on that. But I think they're slightly out with the projects we're looking at here, but they are past that wider consideration about how you might want to take it forward. And I think that will get considered from a BNG MNG interface in that space. I guess estuaries are going to be the most obvious place, so we might think about a pilot around that and how you might want to test it, which I think will bring in all those wider things which need to be considered in this process.
Yeah, definitely. Hank, Hayley, I don't know if you've got any further comment on that, because we've got some other questions that are probably more up your street, but Hank, you've come off mute.
Well, it's just to say that that is a challenging space, the interface between land and sea, and sort of something that I would just sort of add in the considerations and around that is where people notice the changes most. So people are most likely to notice changes along that ribbon where the sea meets the land. And so maybe there's another factor to be considered in the whole process. When you look far, far offshore, as Hayley mentioned, people aren't as concerned when it's far, far offshore. So maybe as time goes forward, measures that happen along the close coast and the estuaries are going to raise in prominence and more importance, because that's where you're likely to see the changes. And then old offshore is just so far away that we almost maybe needed something slightly different to consider out there.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Hank. So there's a question here about the strategic approach to BNG, and Hayley, I'm going to ask you about some of the Maripo work in a moment. Effectively, when we're looking at marine net gain, one of the recommendations that's coming through, as Audrey was saying, is that you need to have a strategic nature restoration plan of some sort, probably with regional programs of measures, and local delivery. It always has to be local delivery. And within that process, you probably either need to have those programs and measures being delivered by government and paid for by the private sector, or private sector being allocated measures that they can deliver that are relevant to them in some way. And again, there's a lot of kind of process that needs to be sorted out within that. And the reason for that is to make sure that there is some form of strategic approach, that we aren't just getting situations where you get 10 developers all delivering the same habitat in a particular place, but you're getting work towards actually meeting those targets, and also that we're aligning our targets appropriately, and that may mean aligning them to good environmental status at different kind of levels. But the most important thing, I think, is that we're talking about prioritization and need when we're looking at that strategic approach. And Hayley, I just wondered whether you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that's gone on in Maripo and Maripo Plus, looking at that prioritization and need question.
Yeah, I can do, definitely. So the work that we're doing at the moment on the Maripo Plus species, which is looking across seabirds, water birds, marine mammals, and fish, is really about gathering together all of those long lists of priority listed, designated, threatened, declining mobile species, and then thinking, what can we possibly do? What's the art of the possible in terms of restoring these populations? And then what's actually likely to be ecologically successful? What's going to have a big impact either on reducing a significant pressure or on actively restoring either population numbers or health? And then how deliverable are those actions in terms of cost, time scale, ability for England to sort of take control and have an impact on the recovery of that particular species without requiring wider cooperation. How would you measure that? Do we have the right monitoring in place? Is there a metric that we can easily measure recovery? And then thinking about what are the wider benefits of different restoration actions. So where do you have actions that are likely to actually impact more than just the particular target species? Where might we have wider climate benefits? Where might we have opportunities where we're looking at more sort of seascape scale restoration actions, where we're not just thinking about things individually? I think if sort of I took anything away from the recent Rememory conference, it's the need or the benefits of looking at things in an interconnected sort of system scale, particularly at the coast, where things are often interdependent on different habitat types, and then those habitats are supporting obviously a multitude of species and ecosystem functions, which then flow to services and benefits. And so that's the sort of thinking that we're going through at the moment. And I think some of that strategic nature restoration plan potentially could hinge upon this sort of seascape scale restoration that's required in different regions, that can then produce some really produce benefits that are much greater than the sum of their parts, if you get the actions at the right scale.
Yes, Hayley, I agree with you. And Ed's put a comment in the chat saying there's potential for MNG to drive habitat recovery at an unprecedented scale. And I think we'd all agree with that, with what Hayley's just said. So we've got a couple of interesting questions in here that I'd like to just drop onto in the last 15 minutes. So there's one from Bethany who asked a question right at the beginning. When we're looking at the pilots, MNG aims to lead us to an ecological gain, but different pathways have different economic and social impacts to people. For example, a delivery pathway inside or outside a 12 nautical limit, or indeed a delivery pathway that stops another user form from doing something, whether that's mineral extraction or fishing or reducing opportunity for energy or whatever that might be. And Bethany asked, are we recommending a holistic assessment to weigh up these pathway options? Audrey, I don't know if you want to just comment on that briefly.
Hi, Bethany. I guess I would say that's slightly out of scope in terms of we are looking at, I guess, purely from a process perspective, how you may or may not be able to deliver MNG, rather than necessarily, I guess, those wider implications, but not saying that they won't be important considerations sort of further down the line. And I think they will actually come to the surface as we start to look at the pathways in more detail, and therefore probably will have to form part of those recommendations. You know, for example, if you highlighted there, if you go here, this will have X impact on a certain sector, which therefore has extra detrimental impacts. So I guess particularly under that pressure reduction theme, which obviously fishing, but other activities could be included, but fishing, I guess, is the most obvious one that people are thinking about. But, you know, that has huge implications. It's not just spatially restricting. If you spatially restrict it, how might you think about any sort of displacement impacts? Therefore, would you need to take effort out of the system? And therefore, what does that mean for the actual fishing industry? So I think even though that's not necessarily directly part of the processes, I think it will become part of the considerations, because it can't not do.
Yeah, just to add to that, Audrey, I think there are some delivery pathways where even before you get to the practical bit of what is the opportunity for this, there are questions like, legally, can you do this? And if legally you can do it, then from a social and economic perspective, do you want to do it? And if you want to do it, what are some of the impacts on people? And then what's the opportunity once you've got past those things? And they won't necessarily be sequential, but as Audrey was saying, they do need to be considered. And some of, as I keep talking about some of this project, some of the work that's ongoing at the moment is the normal policy building process of understanding what are the questions we need to ask, what are the impacts on all the people that are involved, what's the benefit for the environment, and how do we actually practically deliver things. And I don't think there are any easy answers, unfortunately. There's a question here for you, Hank, from Timothy Robbins, who said, have you considered how MNG might feed into comparative assessment approach for decommissioning activities? So removal of artificial reefs arising from offshore installations that could reduce biodiversity in an area that may need to be mitigated, for equally artificial reefs being maintained in the environment may assist MNG. It's a really live conversation in OSPAR at the moment, and in the oil and gas industry, as well as the offshore wind industry. So Hank, I don't know if you can make any comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, that's a very interesting question. It's a very, very interesting, and I think it's complicated too, because it's not at the moment. For example, Timothy, as you and probably others might know, the biodiversity that grows in and around structures, particularly oil and gas platforms, that life is not considered when it comes to conservation assessments. It's actually viewed as a very separate thing. So when you get reef communities growing on rocky substrates, for example, they can be considered as a part of of a nature restoration framework. However, when you get those growing on structures like oil and gas platforms, it's not currently factored in to that type of thinking. So I think, yes, biodiversity net gain could be brought in to comparative assessment approaches, which, as we know, comparative assessment is an assessment approach used to weigh up the environmental gains and losses, the economic gains and losses, the social gains and losses associated with removing old oil and gas infrastructure from the seabed. You would run through that process, and in most cases, all of the infrastructure is lifted out and disposed of on land. If there was a way that the biodiversity could be valued and considered as a natural benefit, then I think you could start to explore marine net gain in the context of comparative assessment. But there are a few hurdles first to go through there. The valuation is one, as I've mentioned. Considering it to be included in a different policy space is another one. And then, I think finally is just understanding the ecology behind that whole system. We don't fully understand, the ecological effects, the pros and the cons there. So there is research in that space that's happening. So yes, good question. I would stay tuned there, because we've got some research in Insight and Valmas that will be looking at that exact question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hayley, a quick one from Kathy, who's said that the Maripo Plus work sounds really useful and aligns with other Scottish work. What's the timescale for publishing or sharing that work? Can you?
So yeah, this is a project we're currently in the middle of for Natural England, which is running up to the end of the financial year. So publishing wise, I would imagine some point after the end of March 2025, unless we're able to discuss it in more detail before that, which we can certainly ask about.
Yeah, yeah, Kathy, we can let you know the Natural England lead as well, so you probably be able to reach out. So there's a couple of, we've got 8 minutes left, and I've got 2 questions here, both of which are really interesting. One from Chris Brody and one from Ben Wilson. So Chris, there's a question here about how would we approach discussions and MNG analysis or any kind of nature restoration kind of prioritization work where we're looking at recovery across a region, especially for socioeconomic cross-boundary species and or species with larval drift like scallops, but in fact, and any marine species that isn't completely sessile on the seabed and is moving around a bit. Particularly at the EU, French and Irish borders. I don't think we can really comment on the geopolitics in there, but I was wondering whether anyone wanted to sort of comment on that broader kind of approach.
I can take a quick stab at that. I would keep it. I would say keeping open lines of communication. I would say talking with our partners is a really good place to start. Anyone else on the panel want to build on that?
No, I would agree, Hank. Also, Hayley, across you. Particularly around sort of ecosystem modelling approaches, we know that they have the, particularly for mobile species, they're considering the population in that wider North Sea scope, say, as opposed to just the English or Scottish sections of it. So we definitely need to consider that when we're taking it forward. But echoing what Hank says, we can only do what's within our control. So it is keeping those open lines of communication and make sure we're speaking across the right sort of scientific communities. Hayley.
Yeah, I would echo that and just add that I think within the work that we're doing at the moment on mobile species restoration actions and kind of potential for ecological success and deliverability, we're prioritizing those things currently over which we can have more control on their delivery and success. So where you would require wide scale international cooperation to deliver a particular restoration action, or the species is so wide ranging that you could invest a lot in trying to recover a particular breeding bird species that's in English waters for a portion of its life, but then there's a lot of other factors that are going on internationally that could influence the recovery of that species. That is, I guess, deprioritized in the sense that it will be very, very difficult to achieve that recovery and that gain on our own. So it's really difficult.
Yeah, thank you, Hayley. And just to make things more difficult, but we're going to finish on a question from Ben. I'm going to come to you, Hank, on this. So get ready for that. So Ben has said active restoration is bringing back past scenarios and pressure reduction is improving the present. Any thoughts or opportunities around future seas given climate change projections? And the reason I'm coming to you for that, Hank, is because of some of the great work that's going on in ECOWind by the different teams there. But I wonder if you had any sort of thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, it's a blend. It's a blend of both. I think is important. Some of the approaches that we're seeing in programs like ECOWind, they are developing quite a few ecosystem models, things that are looking at the ecosystem from the water column right up through the food chain, and then others that are looking at the seabed right up through the food chain, looking at models of food webs and the flows of energy through a system right from the bottom of the food chain all the way to the top. And in all of those, they do show, I mean, it's early days on those models. You're going to see a lot more in the next couple of years. But models like that will help us see the benefits for active restoration, but also areas where you can reduce the pressures. So models like this, they give us the ability to test ideas out. I mean, essentially, when we employ marine management strategies, often it's based on the needs of industries and government, and environmental needs, and bringing those together into management scenarios where we can test the very ideas that Ben's raising and then put them into the models gives us a much better idea about what might happen in the future. And Ben's quite right to raise climate change as an aspect there, because the seas are changing quite rapidly. We had sort of unprecedented warming in the North Sea last year, and that wasn't on any of the predictions. That just happened. So we're going to get increasing changes like that in our water column, and again, we can also put those in as a type of pressure into the models. So I think going forward, using sort of academic tools and models is a really good way that we can get a much better idea of future challenges, and an idea whether or not active restoration of specific targets is the best way to go, or reducing or reducing pressure. I would just encourage anyone to feed into efforts of that nature where you can contribute to those model scenarios, because that's a great way to test out your ideas in such an environment.
Great, thanks, Hank. I would also encourage people to look at projects like MSpace, which is Anna Kiros's project under SMMR, who's been looking at climate change projections and MPA designation. And some really interesting things that have come out of there that maybe if we had better understandings of climate change, we might have designated our MPAs in slightly different places, which is quite fascinating as well. I think there's a thing where policy and decision making, so MSpace is up there. Sorry, Liz, I didn't see that. So yes, I would recommend going to have a look at that. It's really good. There's a thing at the moment where policy and planning is sort of running to keep up with what's coming out of the science community. And similarly, the science community is having to run to keep up with what's coming out of the policy community. Everything's moving quite fast at the moment. So as Hank says, we would encourage you to feed in as much as possible. It is 1 o'clock, so we're going to have to finish now. Thank you all for coming today. This will, of course, be recorded and put on our website. And thank you for coming, for those of you who've come to the whole series of webinars that we've been running. We hope you found them useful. Yes, and do go and look at our website for all the ones we've done in the past. Hope you have a good week, and thank you again to Audrey and Hayley and Hank. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.